Hello world, here we are on CDC.gov. Let's talk about XMRV. Straight from the horse's mouth. Let's see what the CDC has to say about it, and then let's analyze it. Analyze their words, because that's what we all should be doing right now. What are XMRV and MLVs? XMRV refers to a recently discovered retrovirus called xenotropic murine leukemia virus-related virus. It was first identified in 2006 in samples from men with prostate cancer. XMRV is closely related to a group of retroviruses called murine leukemia viruses. And yes, that should be leukemia. You can Google MLVs yourself, but the CDC made a typo here. Remember that. They made this typo. Looks to me like they rushed this page. That's just my opinion. XMRV, I'll read the sentence again. XMRV is closely related to a group of retroviruses called murine leukemia viruses, which are known to cause cancer in certain mice. Remember that as well, that MLVs are known to cause cancer in certain mice. What is chronic fatigue syndrome? Chronic fatigue syndrome, or CFS, is a debilitating and complex disorder characterized by profound fatigue that is not improved by bed rest and that may be worsened by physical or mental activity. Persons with chronic fatigue syndrome most often function at a substantially lower level of activity than they were capable of before the onset of the illness. In addition to these key defining characteristics, patients report various nonspecific symptoms including weakness, muscle pain, impaired memory and/or mental concentration, insomnia, post-exertional fatigue lasting more than 24 hours. In some cases, CFS can persist for years. The cause or causes of CFS have not been identified and no specific diagnostic tests are available. Moreover, since many illnesses have incapacitating fatigue as a symptom, care must be taken to exclude other known and often treatable conditions before a diagnosis of CFS is made. This is true. I will interject at this point and say that I recovered from neurolyme as of a few years ago, and late-stage neurolyme is a hell of a lot like chronic fatigue syndrome. They have basically the same symptom set, or at least all the chronic fatigue symptoms they list here can be also caused by Lyme disease. I'm not trying to insinuate they're the same, because they're not. Even, they're similar in symptom set, but they are not the same illness. That would be crazy. I will move on at this point. Have XMRV and MLVs been associated with human disease and illness, including chronic fatigue syndrome? As noted above, XMRV was first identified in 2006 in patients with prostate cancer. A study published by Lombardi and colleagues in Science 2009 reported finding evidence of XMRV in about 2/3 of chronic fatigue syndrome patients and nearly 4% of healthy persons. However, several other recent studies found no evidence of XMRV in persons with chronic fatigue syndrome and in controls. These studies include a report published by CDC investigators and colleagues in July 2010. More recently, researchers from the Food and Drug Administration, the National Institute of Health, and Harvard Medical School reported evidence of MLVs in about 87% of chronic fatigue syndrome patients and 7% of healthy blood donors. This was done in 2010, only a year later from that 2009 study. This study is 10 years old, a year after that study in Science. The reporting of different research findings from different studies is not uncommon. The different findings may be due to a variety of factors, such as differences in study populations. At the present time, the potential role of XMRV and MLVs in causing diseases such as prostate cancer and chronic fatigue syndrome and the frequency of XMRV and MLV infection among healthy persons are unknown. If it is determined that XMRV and MLVs have a role in causing disease and illness in humans, prevention recommendations can be made. Okay, let's break this down here for a hot second. So we know a 2009 paper published in Science, one of the biggest science magazines in the world, found 2/3 of chronic fatigue syndrome patients had XMRV, and 4% of healthy persons had it. CDC claims several other recent studies found no evidence of XMRV in persons with chronic fatigue syndrome, but they only cite one of these studies specifically. It was published in July 2010. That's, a year later? Also, there's studies that show no evidence of XMRV in persons with chronic fatigue syndrome and in controls. What's no evidence? They're just saying they found no evidence. They're not showing us the evidence to the contrary. They're not giving us the raw data like they did up here, like they did here. They're not giving us the numbers. I want to know the numbers in this study, but I can't get that on the CDC's website. I wonder why they're not showing us the numbers of this study that was claimed to show no evidence and no correlation of XMRV in people with CFS. If we look at this study, it was done with government involvement, but also by Harvard Medical School, a non-government agency, a non-government entity. They report MLVs in 87% of CFS patients and 7% of healthy blood donors. If it is determined that XMRV and MLVs have a role in causing disease and illness in humans, prevention recommendations can be made. Okay. All right. So they're not giving us the data from the study that they conducted. They're only giving us data that supports the hypothesis from multiple studies, that supports the hypothesis that XMRV and MLV could have a correlation here or potentially be causal for chronic fatigue syndrome. They only give us that data. The data that they claim rules out that hypothesis, they don't show us. That's interesting to me. Also interesting to me, 7% of healthy blood donors having MLVs. That's interesting to me. 7% of healthy blood donors have MLVs. We know MLVs cause cancer in mice. And we also know that Lyme disease is transmissible through blood transfusions. And they don't screen for that either. You know what else they didn't screen for in the 80s in the blood supply? HIV. And according to the person who ran this 2009 study, who they don't mention here, Dr. Judy Mikovits, you can Google her. She's been widely discredited and smeared. And according to her, Fauci, it was his idea not to screen the blood supply for HIV. The same Fauci running the show today. It's time to think for yourselves, folks. I'm not asking for much here. I'm just asking for a little bit of accountability. It's time to think for yourselves.